He was shot 11 times. He lost his left eye to a sniper's bullet in World War I, and his entire left hand to an exploding shell. He survived 2 separate plane crashes, only to parachute out of a third burning aircraft. When his doctors moved too slowly to amputate the mangled fingers dangling from his wounded hand, he bit them off himself with his own teeth. This is not the plot of some action movie or the exaggerated tale of a folklore hero. This is the documented, verified life of Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart, one of the most decorated and most severely wounded officers in British military history. And perhaps the most shocking part of his story is not what happened to him, but what he said about it all. After decades of being shot, blown up, and broken, his only comment was this: "Frankly, I enjoyed the war." His story is not just one of survival against impossible odds. It is a story of sheer, almost incomprehensible refusal to quit, even when his body had every reason to give up. From the scorching deserts of Somalia to the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of the Somme, from the frozen mountains of Norway to the prisoner of war camps of Italy, Adrian Carton de Wiart was a magnet for combat and a living legend for his terrifying resilience. The normal rules of warfare, injury, and human limitation simply did not apply to him. He served in the Boer War at the turn of the century, fought through the entire First World War, and was still commanding troops in World War II when he was in his 60s. The only thing that could finally retire him was old age, and even that took 48 years of continuous conflict to accomplish. You're about to hear the true, almost forgotten story of the man who became known as the unkillable soldier. This is the full odyssey of how one general survived every bullet, explosion, and crash that the 20th century could throw at him. What was the secret to his survival? Was it pure, blind luck? Or was it something deeper, a maniacal love for the chaos of battle that somehow protected him? Was he fearless, or was he simply too obsessed with war to let death get in the way? This is the story of Adrian Carton de Wiart, and it begins, appropriately enough, with a lie. The year is 1899. Adrian Carton de Wiart is just 19 years old, and he has a serious problem. He is meant to be studying law at Balliol College, Oxford, living the comfortable life of Belgian aristocracy transplanted to England. But Britain has just gone to war in South Africa against the Boer republics, and young Adrian cannot stand it. He cannot bear the quiet discipline of a university lecture hall while men are fighting and dying overseas. The distant thunder of war captivated him in a way that no book or professor ever could. So he did what any young man obsessed with combat would do. He dropped out of Oxford without telling his family, lied about his age to meet the military requirements, and lied about his nationality to smooth his entry into the British Army. He was Belgian by birth, but he claimed to be British to join the fight. Within weeks, he was on a ship bound for South Africa, heading straight into the brutal guerrilla warfare of the Second Boer War. He got exactly what he craved, and it nearly killed him. Within his first few weeks of combat, young Adrian was shot twice, once in the shoulder and once in the stomach. These were not grazing wounds or minor injuries. They were serious, life-threatening wounds that would have sent most men home permanently. He was evacuated back to England to recover, technically discharged from service due to the severity of his injuries. His military career should have ended right there, before it really began. But Adrian Carton de Wiart was not like most men. His appetite for the extreme had only been whetted. As soon as he could walk again, as soon as he could hold a rifle, he rejoined the military under yet another set of false claims about his fitness for service. His war wasn't over. In his mind, it had just started. For the next decade, de Wiart actively hunted for war wherever he could find it. He transferred between regiments, always seeking the posting with the most action. In 1914, as a captain in the Somaliland Camel Corps, he finally found the combat he had been craving. The British were fighting a brutal campaign against the forces of Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, known as the Mad Mullah in British Somaliland. It was vicious, close-quarters combat in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. De Wiart loved every minute of it. In 1915, while leading an attack on a dervish fortress, disaster struck. He was hit twice in quick succession, once in the arm and once directly in the face. This was not a minor facial wound. The bullet entered through his left cheek and tore through the socket. completely destroying his left eye. The pain must have been unimaginable. He was medically evacuated and taken to a field hospital, where surgeons worked to save his life and remove the ruined eye. He was fitted with a glass prosthetic eye, the standard practice for such injuries. But Wiart hated it. He found the glass eye uncomfortable and pointless. Within days, he simply removed it and threw it away, choosing instead to wear a simple black eye patch over the jagged scar that now defined his face. For the rest of his life, he would be instantly recognizable, the one-eyed officer with the scarred face and the unsettling grin. This was the first major piece of himself that combat had taken, and his reaction was entirely characteristic. He immediately requested to be sent to the Western Front where the real war was happening. He wanted to go to France, to the trenches, to the place where men were dying by the thousands every single day. He arrived in France in 1915, just as the Western Front was settling into the grinding, horrific stalemate that would define the First World War. Wiart was given command of infantry units and threw himself into the fighting with the same reckless enthusiasm he had shown in Somalia. But the Western Front was different. This was industrial-scale warfare, where artillery shells fell like rain and machine gun fire cut down entire battalions in minutes. Even for someone like Wiart, the odds were catching up. In 1916, during the brutal fighting around Ypres, his luck, or whatever protected him, was tested again. A German shell exploded directly next to him, close enough that the blast wave threw him off his feet and sent shrapnel tearing through his left hand. When he regained consciousness and looked down, he saw that his hand was a mangled ruin. Two of his fingers were hanging by threads of skin and tendon, barely attached to the rest of his hand. The pain must have been extraordinary, but Wiart's concern was practical. He knew that if gangrene set in, he would lose not just the fingers but possibly the entire arm. He needed immediate medical attention. He made his way to a field hospital, where military doctors examined the damage. They agreed that the fingers had to come off, but they wanted to wait to prepare properly for the amputation, to ensure it was done under the right conditions. Wiart did not want to wait. He had already lost an eye. He was not about to lose his arm to an infection because of bureaucratic medical procedure. So he did something that has become the most famous story of his entire life. He bit off his own fingers. Witnesses reported that he simply pulled the damaged fingers to his mouth and severed them with his teeth, spitting them out onto the ground. The doctors were horrified. Wiart was satisfied. The problem was solved and he could get back to fighting. But his hand continued to cause problems. The wounds from the shell blast became infected despite the crude amputation. The infection spread, and within weeks it became clear that more drastic measures were needed. Surgeons amputated his entire left hand at the wrist. Adrian Carton Wiart was now a one-eyed, one-handed officer in the middle of the most brutal war in human history. Most men would have been sent home, given a medical discharge and a pension, honored for their sacrifice. Wiart refused. He taught himself to fight, to ride, to shoot, and to lead men with one hand and one eye. He was back in the trenches within months. In 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, Wiart performed the actions that would earn him the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Empire. The details of that day are almost beyond belief. He was commanding a battalion in an attack on heavily fortified German positions. The assault was a disaster from the start. Machine gun fire cut down his men in waves, and German artillery turned the battlefield into a hellscape of mud, blood, and explosions. But Wiart refused to retreat. He led charge after charge, personally leading his men over the top again and again. During the fighting, he was wounded multiple times, shot in the head, the leg, and the shoulder. Witnesses reported seeing him stumbling through the chaos, blood streaming down his face, his uniform torn and soaked with blood, still shouting orders and rallying his men. He personally organized the evacuation of wounded soldiers under direct fire, and when his officers suggested retreat, he refused. He held the position for hours until reinforcements arrived. The Victoria Cross citation noted his most conspicuous bravery and utter disregard for danger. It was the understatement of the century. The injuries continued to pile up. Later in 1916, he was shot in the ankle by a sniper, shattering the bones in his foot. He was evacuated again, recovered again, and returned to the front again. In 1917, he was shot through the ear, a bullet that came so close to killing him that it left him temporarily deaf on one side. In 1918, during the final offensives of the war, he was shot in the leg again, this time badly enough that doctors feared they would have to amputate. He refused to let them, and somehow, against all medical expectations, the leg healed enough for him to walk. By the end of World War I, Adrian Carton de Wiart had been shot at least 9 times, had lost an eye and a hand, and had been blown up, shelled, and nearly killed more times than anyone could accurately count. And his response to all of this? He was disappointed that the war was over. The 1920s and 1930s should have been a time of peace and recovery for de Wiart, but peace bored him. He could not adjust to civilian life, could not find satisfaction in the quiet routine of a peacetime existence. So he did something extraordinary. He moved to Poland. He had been appointed as a military liaison to the newly reformed Polish government, and he fell in love with the country. He bought an estate, learned Polish, and threw himself into the aristocratic lifestyle of hunting, gambling, and socializing with Polish nobility. But even in peace, he was always preparing for war. He knew that Poland's position between Germany and the Soviet Union was precarious, and he suspected that war would come again. He was right. During this period, he also survived 2 plane crashes that had nothing to do with combat. In the 1920s, aviation was still relatively new and extremely dangerous, and de Wiart traveled frequently by plane on 2 separate occasions. His aircraft suffered mechanical failures and crashed. Both times he walked away with minor injuries. It was as if even fate itself had given up trying to kill him. In September 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, de Wiart was one of the first to see the writing on the wall. He immediately contacted British military command and volunteered for active duty. He was 60 years old, missing an eye and a hand, and covered in scars from 2 wars. Any reasonable military would have politely declined and given him a desk job. The British Army made him a general and sent him back to the front lines. In 1940, de Wiart was given command of British forces in the Norway Campaign, one of the first major operations of World War II. The campaign was a disaster from a strategic standpoint. The Germans had moved too quickly, and Allied forces were outmaneuvered and forced to evacuate. But de Wiart's personal performance was exactly what you would expect. Despite being a one-armed, one-eyed general in his 60s, he personally led his troops in combat, organized desperate defensive actions, and fought with the same reckless courage he had shown in the trenches of the Somme 25 years earlier. After the Norway evacuation, de Wiart was sent to Yugoslavia to coordinate British support for the government there. But in 1941, his plane was shot down over the Mediterranean Sea. This was his 3rd plane crash, but this time it was in the middle of a war zone. The aircraft went down in flames, and de Wiart had to parachute into the sea. At 61 years old, with one hand, he had to swim to shore while weighed down by his uniform and equipment. He made it to the beach, exhausted and injured, only to be immediately captured by Italian forces. The Italians could not believe what they had caught. A British general, heavily decorated, missing an eye and a hand, and still very much alive despite the plane crash. They sent him to a prisoner of war camp designed for high-ranking officers. Most men would have accepted their fate as a prisoner of war and waited for the war to end. De Wiart immediately began planning his escape. He was 61 years old, missing an eye and a hand, and he started digging a tunnel. For months, he worked in secret, digging with his one hand, hauling dirt, and coordinating with other prisoners. The physical strain on a man his age must have been incredible, but he kept at it. In 1943, he finally broke through. He and several other prisoners escaped through the tunnel and made it outside the camp. They were free. But freedom did not last long. De Wiart was on the run in fascist Italy, with no supplies, no contacts, and one hand. After 8 days of hiding and traveling, trying to make his way to Allied lines or neutral territory, he was recaptured. The Italians were furious, and de Wiart was sent to a higher security facility. But the war was turning, and by 1943, Italy was collapsing. When Italy surrendered to the Allies, de Wiart was finally freed, and his reward for surviving captivity, multiple escape attempts, and years of combat. Winston Churchill personally appointed him as his special representative to China, where de Wiart spent the rest of the war trying to coordinate Allied support for Chinese forces fighting the Japanese. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who loved fighting, who had spent his entire life seeking out combat, was sent to be a diplomat. But Wiart performed his duties with the same dedication he had shown in battle. He traveled throughout China, met with Chiang Kai-shek and other Chinese leaders, and worked tirelessly to support the Allied cause. When World War II finally ended in 1945, Adrian Carton de Wiart had served in 3 major wars spanning nearly 50 years. He had been shot 11 times, had lost an eye and a hand, had survived 3 plane crashes, and had escaped from a prisoner of war camp at the age of 63. And through it all, he had never stopped fighting. Adrian Carton de Wiart finally retired from the British Army in 1947, at the age of 67. The world had gone quiet, and even he seemed to realize that the great wars of his lifetime were over. But his legend was permanent. He remains one of the most decorated and most severely wounded British officers in history. His medals, including the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Service Order with 2 bars, and numerous foreign decorations, were merely a physical testament to a willpower that defied all logic and reason. In his autobiography titled Happy Odyssey, he spoke about his wounds not with regret or bitterness, but with a kind of nostalgic fondness. He never saw his scars as setbacks or tragedies. He saw them as badges of honor, proof of a life lived at its most extreme and intense. When discussing the horrific trenches of the Somme, where he had been shot, mangled, and nearly killed repeatedly, he simply stated that he had enjoyed himself enormously. He wrote about biting off his own fingers as if it were a minor inconvenience, something that needed to be done so he could get back to the real business of fighting. His attitude toward danger, toward pain, toward death itself was unlike anything most people can comprehend. What made Adrian Carton de Wiart so hard to kill? Was it luck? Was it some kind of supernatural protection? Or was it something simpler and more terrifying? A man so in love with war, so addicted to combat, that he refused to let death interrupt his passion. Modern psychologists might diagnose him with any number of conditions, but that feels like a disservice to his story. De Wiart was not crazy, at least not in any simple sense. He was a man who found meaning and purpose in the one place most people find only horror and death. He thrived in chaos. He felt most alive when he was closest to death, and somehow death itself seemed to respect that and kept its distance. The soldiers who fought alongside him told stories of his courage that bordered on the supernatural. They described a man who walked through machine gun fire as if he were taking a stroll in a garden, who laughed off wounds that would have killed other men, who led from the front with such absolute fearlessness that his men had no choice but to follow him. The enemy soldiers who faced him must have felt like they were fighting a ghost or a demon, something that should have been dead a dozen times over, but kept coming back. German soldiers in World War I called him Der verrückte Engländer, the crazy Englishman. Italian guards who watched him dig his escape tunnel with one hand called him Il Pazzo, the madman. But to the British soldiers who served under him, he was simply the general, spoken with a mixture of awe, fear, and profound respect. His story raises uncomfortable questions about war itself. De Wiart loved war in a way that feels almost obscene in the modern era, where we understand the psychological trauma and human cost of combat better than ever before. How do we reconcile his genuine enthusiasm for battle with our contemporary understanding of PTSD, of the horrors of war, of the terrible price that violence exacts on the human soul? Perhaps we cannot reconcile it. Perhaps Adrian Carton de Wiart was simply a man out of time, someone who belonged to an earlier age when war was seen as noble and glorious rather than tragic and wasteful. Or perhaps he was always an outlier, someone whose psychology was so unique that he represents no broader truth about human nature or warfare. But what cannot be denied is his courage. Whatever else you might say about de Wiart and whatever questions his story raises, his bravery was absolute and genuine. He did not seek glory or fame. He was not motivated by ideology or hatred. He simply loved the fight. And when the fight required him to suffer, to lose pieces of himself, to stare death in the face again and again, he never flinched. He never complained. He never quit. He died peacefully in 1963, at the age of 83. The unkillable soldier was finally stopped, not by a bullet, not by a bomb, not by a plane crash, but by time. He died in his bed, surrounded by his family, having lived long enough to see the world change completely from the one he had been born into. The wars he had fought in, the Boer War, the colonial conflicts, the First World War, the Second World War, were already becoming history, their veterans growing old and passing away. And the story he left behind, the story of the 11 times he was shot, the eye and hand he lost, the plane crashes he survived, the tunnel he dug with one hand at 63, and the endless, irrepressible grin he wore through it all, is perhaps the greatest testament to the extraordinary, terrifying, and awe-inspiring capacity of human resilience. When you look at photographs of Adrian Carton de Wiart, you see exactly what you would expect: a scarred, grizzled old warrior with an eye patch and an empty sleeve pinned to his jacket. But if you look closely at those photographs, at the ones taken throughout his life, you notice something else. In almost every picture, he is smiling. Not grimacing, not scowling, but genuinely smiling, as if he were enjoying some private joke that only he understood. And perhaps he was. Perhaps the joke was that he had beaten death so many times that it had become funny. Perhaps the joke was that he had found joy in a place where most men found only misery. Or perhaps the joke was simply that he had lived exactly the life he wanted to live, on his own terms, and nothing, not bullets, not bombs, not the entire 20th century had been able to stop him. This is the story of Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart, the man who was shot 11 times, the man who lost an eye and a hand, the man who survived 3 plane crashes, the man who bit off his own fingers, the man who dug an escape tunnel at 63 with one hand, the man who served in 3 wars over nearly 50 years, the man who said simply and honestly that he enjoyed it all. His story is almost too extraordinary to believe, but every detail is documented, verified, and true. He was real. He lived, he fought, and he won, not by avoiding death, but by refusing to let it matter. If this story of extraordinary resilience and unbreakable will has moved you, honor the memory of this forgotten hero. His life reminds us that the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limit, is capable of things we can barely imagine. Adrian Carton de Wiart was not superhuman. He bled, he suffered, and he lost pieces of himself to the wars he loved. But he never lost the part of himself that mattered most: his will to keep going, his refusal to quit, and his absolute determination to live life on his own terms, no matter the cost. That is his legacy. That is his gift to history. And that is why, more than 60 years after his death, we still tell his story.